Hi everyone, thanks for joining me today, Ross Marcogiani, with another great conversation at revowell.com. Today we're going to be talking about diabetes. We're going to be talking about type 1 and type 2 diabetes. We'll be discussing what it is, what hormones influence or shift us towards diabetes, some signs and symptoms, how we diagnose, and then what we do about it if we are diagnosed with type 1 or type 2 diabetes. So let's get into it. So first, what is diabetes? So before I start talking about this, we need to kind of get the concept of this. So it's all about the relationship of the hormone insulin. Insulin is released from our pancreas from the beta cells. And when we take in food, like a lot of carbohydrates or constantly taking in sugars, that quickly jacks up our blood glucose. So the amount of sugar or carbohydrates or glycogen in our blood. And then that signals to the brain a signal to go down to the pancreas and release insulin. And insulin is going to lower our blood glucose. And that's where we have our issue. We have our issue with diabetes in the production of insulin. Diabetes type 1 is where we have basically a genetic defect, or what researchers think is a Coxsackie virus was produced in utero and causes it to basically cause an autoimmunity and attack the pancreas and attack the beta cells and the islet cells of the pancreas. So it destroys those cells that produce insulin. Type 2 is kind of like what I like to describe as like someone knocking at the door. So this is when we take in a lot of simple carbs or a lot of sugar, we jack up our blood glucose, it causes our pancreas to release insulin to lower that blood glucose, but since we're constantly taking in carbs, we're constantly relying on our pancreas to release this insulin, and the pancreas eventually just becomes worn out. So the analogy I like to put, imagine someone knocking at the door. So think of that as you take in a bunch of carbs, you take in a bunch of sugar, it jacks up your blood glucose, and now that glucose is knocking, constantly, just at first, softly knocking. Eventually, we get numb to it, and we don't hear that knocking anymore. Now they're pounding on the door. So we start to hear the pounding, pancreas releases insulin, and then the pounding, we forget the pounding at the door. Now the person is screaming outside, and then they keep going, and we become numb to the screaming. And what happens to that person outside? He eventually becomes tired, and he gets exhausted, and he stops doing what he's doing. And that's what's happening here with the pancreas. Eventually it gets tired, and it stops producing insulin. So some hormones that will increase our insulin levels will be cortisol. So making sure we have cortisol in check, that will increase our blood glucose. Our growth hormone or adrenocorticotropic hormone will increase our blood glucose. Epinephrine is going to increase our blood glucose. Glucagon released will increase our blood glucose. And then thyroxine, the hormone from our thyroid, will increase our blood glucose. So those are all hormones that we can have an influence on and regulate so that they're not, really, really high, causing an increase in our blood glucose and then also causing stress on that pancreas. So if we can monitor those hormones that I just described, we can do a good job of monitoring our diabetes. So our signs and symptoms here. Typically we'll have what's called the 3 Ps, polyuria, polyphagia, polydipsia. So polyuria just means you have to go to the bathroom a lot, you have to urinate a lot. Polyphagia means you have increased hunger. And then polydipsia is that you're constantly thirsty. We'll also see bilateral carpal tunnel. We can see sexual impotence. We can see distal neuropathies, polyneuropathies, bilateral. So maybe loss of sensation in hands and feet or poor wound healing. We could also see loss of sense in position and vibration as well. So those will be some signs and symptoms. And then diagnosis. So we have a couple ways to diagnose diabetes. The first one is going to be our fasting blood glucose. So if we see a fasting blood glucose of less than 126, that will typically indicate type 2 diabetes. If we see a random blood glucose, so you know, fasting, you have to take the test without eating for 8 hours, but a random blood glucose is you just take your blood glucose at any point in time, and if that's over 200, that could also indicate to type 1 or type 2. But the gold standard here is going to be our hemoglobin A1C. So if we take a hemoglobin A1C, which basically looks at the life cycle of our red blood cell, roughly 120 days, and if we see that our hemoglobin A1C is greater than 6.4, that's going to be a strong indication as well to diabetes. So how do we manage this? Well, with type 1 diabetes, it's typically going to be an insulin injection, and you basically have to take it for the rest of your life. But for type 2 diabetes is where we can come in and we can definitely monitor and manage it and get remission in some cases. So this will typically be done good exercising daily for at least 30 minutes, moderate to high intensity, making sure that we're eating right, we're having low glycemic foods. So low glycemic foods will not cause a rapid increase in blood glucose. It will be a slow release of glucose in the blood. Eating small meals, so we're not taking big bolus of food during one sitting, and also having good variations in food so that we aren't going to just constantly be spiking blood glucose up with like simple carbs. Also, taking in chromium will be helpful as well, with 150 to 200 milligrams. Some have shown that cinnamon is helpful to take as well, and just making sure that we're monitoring our diet and that we're taking, low glycemic foods in, and that we're not constantly eating large meals. We want to have about 6 small meals a day, which will be helpful. And then also looking at these other hormones that I talked about, our cortisol, our epinephrine, our thyroxine, our glucagon, our growth hormone, getting those stabilized so we're not constantly causing an increase in blood glucose. I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or contact me on my website. And if you know anyone that can benefit from this, please share this with them. Because like I always say, we're in this together to become healthier and happier. Have a great day.